Welcome, everyone. If you can start taking your seats. All right, first couple of housekeeping tips. If you could turn or silent your cell phones. We'll do that first. Next, I have one announcement. And Deb will send out invitation, but on November 5th, we have the National State Legislators Female Division. It's a conference that's in town, and there will be a dinner here at 6, but from 5 to 6, about 40 people would like to do a docent tour. So we'll probably need 8 of you to volunteer, which I know you love doing private tours. So Deb will send that out. It's for November 5th, 5 o'clock. We'll break them up into 4 groups. Okay, this is our third, I guess we've got kind of this intimate type conversation. The first was with Barbara and Jenny, 2 hours. You got to see really the concept and the ideas that were developed for this hotel, the renovation, where we're at, their thought process, which was fantastic. Then the last one last month was Bruce Bernstein, who is a PhD and knows everything about Native American art and his concept on what we have here in the hotel and this incredible art collection and the different Native American concepts. And today, we have a very special guest. I'm just going to read first a quick bio. Stephen Fried, an award-winning investigative journalist and essayist and an adjunct professor at Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism. He's the author of the highly praised books, Thing of Beauty, The Tragedy of Supermodel Gia, Bitter Pills, Inside the Hazardous World of Legal Drugs, The New Rabbi and Husbandry, Sex, Love, and Dirty Laundry, Inside the Minds of Married Men. I don't know, is there much inside the minds of married men? And his, I don't know if this is your latest, but this is 5 years old. Book, Appetite for America, Fred Harvey and the Business of Civilizing the West One Meal at a Time. This was published in 2010 and by the Wall Street, named one of the 10 best books of 2010 by Wall Street Journal and the Philadelphia Inquirer. A 2-time winner of the National Magazine Award, the Pulitzer Prize of magazine winning, Frieda has been a prolific writer of feature stories and personal essays for Vanity Fair, Washington Post Magazine, GQ, Rolling Stone, Glamour, Ladies' Home Journal, and Philadelphia Magazine. He also served for 2 years editor-in-chief. He also lectures widely on the subjects of his books and magazine pieces, so I would like to introduce Stephen Fried.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? So, just out of curiosity, how many of you have seen me talk about Fred Harvey before? Oh, so not that many. That's good. I didn't know there were that many people left in Santa Fe who hadn't heard me talk about Fred Harvey. I want to thank you very much, Ed, for inviting me to come speak today, and Jenny for always having us in the hotel, and for the hotel and the New Mexico History Museum supporting this work. This is our 5th year of doing Fred Harvey programming since the book came out, and I cannot believe that it just keeps growing in interest, which is a very cool thing. I remember when the idea of a docents program here was just being discussed. I think there was like 1 of you then, and the idea that there would now be so many who are interested in the hotel and interested in the collections in Santa Fe, and today interested in Fred Harvey. That's great, and it's amazing that it's just still growing. So I'm going to give you the full Fred Harvey course. For those of you who know, the first time I ever gave this lecture was at the New Mexico History Museum, and the minute I was about to start, all the lights went out in Santa Fe. So, and if you've been in the auditorium of the New Mexico History Museum, you know it's really dark when the lights go out. So we gave the whole lecture in the dark with a flashlight that one of Fred Harvey's granddaughters had in her purse. Little Lego flashlight that she had from her kid. And I lit myself. It was like telling campfire stories. And it was a lot of fun. So we'll hope the lights will stay on during this talk. So this is actually the newest old picture of Fred Harvey that we have recovered. For those of you who've been over to the museum, you've seen it. But until the museum show opened last year, no one had ever seen this picture. It had been sitting in Kay Harvey's house for a really long time. She didn't realize that it was the only unpublished photo that existed of Fred Harvey. I first found out about Fred Harvey, like many people do, at the Grand Canyon. So how many of you, everybody here has been to the Grand Canyon, right? Been to El Tovar. So you know that when you go to the Grand Canyon, you go to El Tovar, when you're waiting in what is often a very long line to get in for breakfast or lunch, you see this portrait of Fred Harvey. And my wife and I saw this portrait on a trip in 1993, and we looked at it and we both asked each other, well, who's Fred Harvey? And we went up to our room at El Tovar, and there was some pamphlets there that talked about Fred Harvey, and we still had no idea who Fred Harvey was. We grew up in the East. You know, we know who Howard Johnson is, but we don't know who Fred Harvey is. And then we stayed at the Grand Canyon for a grand total of about 30 hours, so really good tourists, really saw everything, really took in all the natural beauty. And then we had planned to go visit Painted Desert, which, when you live in Philadelphia, looks on the map like it's pretty close to the Grand Canyon. So we drove there, and as you know, during certain parts of the year, the Petrified Forest closes at 5 o'clock. So we got there at 4:45, and we drove like 60 miles an hour through the entire thing. So again, took in all the natural beauty, really great Eastern tourists, the kind I'm sure you make your eyes roll when you meet them on your docent trips. And we got to the end, and there was a gift shop, and it had a huge Fred Harvey sign, and my wife turned to me and said, who the hell is Fred Harvey? And that was pretty much the beginning of our interest in this. This is my wife, the author Diane Ayers, or as she is known in the Southwest, Black Bart, taken during this trip at El Tovar, and she is spinning 6 guns that I bought her at the Fred Harvey gift shop at El Tovar. The set came with a badge, as you can see, and holsters. And I had this picture over my desk for years before I actually thought about writing about Fred Harvey, because it captured that exuberance that people have for cowboys and Indians, no matter how old they are. And as I thought about learning about Fred Harvey, part of what's interesting about Fred Harvey is that the Harvey Company brought that Western story to the whole country. And when you think about the timing of it, you know, the Fred Harvey Company rose after the Civil War. And in the Civil War, almost everything that Americans romanticized together about their country stopped being very romantic because they had just about all killed each other. So it's not surprising that right after people started focusing on the West, which is one of the only things that the North and the South could romanticize together. And if you think that cowboys and Indians became really popular during your lifetime, the truth is that almost immediately after the Civil War, you started seeing stories about this in the newspapers. And when Billy the Kid died in 1881, it was on the front page of every newspaper in the country the next day. So the romantic notion of the West is something that was very powerful back then. And the Fred Harvey Company kind of packaged it for people and got people sort of re-excited about America. This is actually me in front of that last Fred Harvey sign, which is still at the Painted Desert. This is the last actual building you can go to. It says a big Fred Harvey sign, and this is my wife in front of the sign there. So eventually, all these years later, I ended up writing a book about Fred Harvey, which some of you have read, and hopefully the rest of you will read soon. And you're all here for what is now the 5th annual Fred Head Weekend, where people come from all over the world, including Harvey relatives usually come from England, for a weekend of Fred programming. We've done Mary Coulter weekends. We've done a lot of different weekends. This weekend, we're focusing partly on the later years of the Fred Harvey Company, which also involves Fonda. But the basic Fred Harvey course is pretty short. So this is Fred. Fred came to America in 1853, and he worked in New York City, and we'll go through all the pictures of that. He had a whole career working in the food business, working in the railroad business, and then in 1876, he opened a small restaurant in this building in Topeka, Kansas, where it says Dining Hall right there. And from that small restaurant for the Atchison-Topeka Railroad, which from up to this point had food that was put out in each city. And the thing about railroad food you have to remember is it was unbelievably bad. There were stories in the newspapers at this time about how it was more dangerous to eat the food on the railroads than it was that if the trains crashed or if they were hit by lightning. And so the idea was, and there were no dining cars west of Chicago because the railroads had all agreed to do this. So all the food was being served in small, bad restaurants where you came in, were given bad food about 5 minutes before the train was supposed to leave. Then you ate as much as you could. You went back into the train car, and they scraped the food off the plate onto another plate and served it to the person who came in on the next train. So Fred was pretty sure that if he did this better, he would have a great business. This is what his business became. And when you look at this map, which is really from the turn of the century, keep in mind that we're used to seeing companies like this now that are this big. It's not surprising to see a chain. But this is the first chain of anything in the world, okay, because there were no chain restaurants, there were no chain stores in the 1800s and the early 1900s. So the Harvey Company was the first chain of anything and extended originally from Kansas City all the way to Southern California. And then later, as the railroad expanded, it expanded north from Los Angeles up to San Francisco, where the Fred Harvey restaurants were on boats that went back and forth between Oakland and San Francisco because trains didn't come into San Francisco then. And it also extended down through Missouri, Oklahoma, Texas, all the way to Galveston. So it was in 80 different cities, and it was a huge, huge company. It started out with very small buildings that were wooden buildings that had lunch counters, sort of the progenitor of what we'd say is a diner. And right next to it was a formal dining room with white tablecloths brought in from England, China, beautiful silver, and they also had takeout coffee. So it was sort of a combination of the most beautiful dining room you could eat at, the best diner you were ever at, and Starbucks. And they were really kind of three different businesses, plus the business of coming onto the train and selling people stuff. So it started out as these small train stations in the 1800s, small wooden buildings that had dining rooms. In the late 1800s, the company decided to start building bigger buildings, the company being the Santa Fe Railroad. Fred Harvey had the contract to provide all the food and hospitality for the Santa Fe Railroad. So the Santa Fe Railroad, in the late 1800s, started building larger buildings based on the idea that people would actually come to the Southwest on purpose. Because, of course, up to this point, the Southwest was sort of the flyover states for the railroad business. It was someplace you had to go through stinking desert on the way to California. It was not a place that people thought they would go to. But the Santa Fe had the idea that they would start a tourism business in the Southwest, so they needed to build bigger hotels. This was the first one. How many of you guys have been to the Hotel Castaneda? I got to say, when I first started giving this talk, it was a depressing part of the talk about how the Hotel Castaneda was never going to be reopened again. So it's really nice to be giving this talk and knowing that it's being restored even as we speak. Some of us are going to all be there tomorrow. The Castaneda became famous not only because it was the first beautiful mission hotel in the Southwest, but because in order to draw attention to it, the Santa Fe Railroad convinced Teddy Roosevelt to hold the first Rough Riders reunion there. So it became a big national story. The whole national press came. It was during this time that they built the Alvarado Hotel in Albuquerque. And also at this time, the company, which had previously been in really small towns along the railroad line, started getting involved in Union Station businesses. Now keep in mind, until 1896, there were no Union stations in this country. All railroads had their own stations in cities, and you couldn't switch railroads in a train station. So in the 1890s, the first big one was in St. Louis, and the Fred Harvey Company ran everything in that, not only the food, but all the retail. And they later did that in lots of other cities as they built Union stations. And then in 1905, they opened El Tovar at the Grand Canyon. This was a side project. No one knew how it would go, but in fact, El Tovar became the biggest part of the Fred Harvey Company. The Grand Canyon was the biggest part of its operation. It continued to open Union stations, Kansas City Union Station, which became its main headquarters, even though before that they all had worked in Kansas City but did not have a restaurant there. And then Chicago Union Station, it is hard to believe there was a time there were huge red signs on the side of Chicago Union Station saying Fred Harvey. The year after Chicago Union Station, 1926, is when the Fred Harvey Company took over what became La Fonda and started started the Indian Detour. And the Indian Detour was the first really high-level tourism of the Southwest. And the people who were at the Indian Detour met in this room. Okay, so people came here. This was the initial meeting room. And the lectures were given from these balconies up here and from that balcony in the back. So people were brought here as the beginning of their Indian Detour, and then they were taken in Harvey cars all over the Southwest. The last big hotel that was built by the company was La Posada in Winslow. How many of you have been there? Okay, so more people have been there than okay. And basically, at its peak, the Fred Harvey Company had depot operations in more than 80 cities, including most of the major stops along Route 66, which ran pretty much along the Santa Fe Railroad. 25 hotels, 40 white tablecloth dining rooms, 54 lunchrooms, and they did add dining cars finally at the turn of the century, so they had 60 dining cars. 7,000 employees serving 12 million meals a year. They had their own company dairy and poultry farms. their own bottling plant in Emporia, which was the only place in the country that was licensed to bottle its own Coca-Cola. And they had major tourism operations at the Grand Canyon here in Santa Fe, all the Union stations, and they were also in the airline business, and I'll tell you about that later. The last of the great train stations in America was Los Angeles Union Station, which was an all Fred Harvey station. The Harvey Company went down during the Depression. Many places closed. But then the Second World War turned out to be a boon for the company. The government asked them to reopen all the Harvey houses. Every Harvey girl who could still hold a tray was brought back into work. And the Harvey houses were turned into huge cafeterias for all the soldiers that were moving along all over the Midwest and West. This is part of the reason why in 1946 it seemed like a really good idea to have a romantic movie about the past of the Harvey girls. And this was a huge box office success, which the company hoped would be their next jumping off point to having Fred Harvey continue to be bigger and bigger. But in fact, after the war was over, the railroad decided that it did not want to keep open all these eating houses, and the Harvey Company physically shrank in terms of its number of locations. And this is what it looked like after the war. So in the Southwest, you still had a number of the places that we love here, but all the places in Kansas and Missouri and in California, most of them were closed. And that's what the company looked like. Pretty much it contracted a little bit until it went public in 1966 and then was sold to a conglomerate in 1968. The company still exists. When you go to the Grand Canyon, you are still being taken care of by the Fred Harvey Company, which was subsumed by Xanterra Resorts, which runs the Grand Canyon. So that's the short Fred Harvey course. You can take a breath. And now we're going to go deep because I know you guys want to know the real stuff. So this is the earliest picture we have of Fred Harvey when he came to America in 1853. He worked at this restaurant in New York, which is right next to where the boats came in, Smith and McNell's. It was a merchant restaurant where they bought the stuff in the market that day and they cooked whatever was in the market. Smith and McNell settled with each other every night because they didn't trust each other or anybody else. So Fred Harvey learned about America, he learned about capitalism pretty quickly, and he was what was called a potwalloper, or a dishwasher at this restaurant. He worked there for a year and a half to learn the business, and then he moved to St. Louis. I will warn you that Fred Harvey had a history of bad hair days, and this is one of his many hairdos and one of his many beards. This is a picture that was taken of him in St. Louis. He moved to St. Louis, opened a restaurant with a partner, and he did well there. He did well enough that his restaurant was actually, if you go to St. Louis to the Arch, his restaurant was almost exactly under where the middle of the arch is now. He had this restaurant for a couple of years. He went back to England and brought a bride back. They had a child. They had another child on the way. This is what he looked like during this time. And then several bad things happened. One, the war broke out. St. Louis was one of the most divided cities in the war. His partner was a Southern sympathizer, and he left one day with all their money, and the restaurant went out of business. Fred's wife at this time was pregnant with their second child, and when she gave birth, she died. So Fred was, by the time he was about 27 years old, had gone from having the American dream, having his own business, being prosperous, to being a single father of 2 infants and being penniless. He also developed typhoid fever during this time, and you can tell this is a picture that was taken at the time. He became incredibly gaunt. He worked on the boats that went back and forth in the Missouri River, and also worked for the post office on the first postal sorting train because he lived in St. Joseph, Missouri. He finally remarried to a woman he knew from St. Louis, Sally Mattis, and they ended up moving to beautiful downtown Leavenworth, Kansas. Now, Leavenworth, Kansas is not a place that is probably on your big tourism bucket list. But at the time, Leavenworth, Kansas was supposed to be the next great city after St. Louis. They expected to be the next great railroad city. It was the first city in Kansas where the fort was. It was reasonable for Fred to work, that move there and think that he was moving to a prosperous place. He became the main ticket agent there and the main, also for the wagon trains, because the trains only went as far as Missouri. So anything past Missouri went on a wagon train on the Santa Fe Trail all the way to the west. Unfortunately, more bad things happened to Fred. He was in town for less than a month before both of his children from his previous wife died of scarlet fever. So most people got to know him initially because of the obituaries in the newspaper for his children. And he and his wife rebuilt their lives there. So we actually have a lot of Fred stuff, and if you haven't been over to the show at the museum, you should check it out, because these things, which were once lost, are now found. The family had them. The family donated them to the New Mexico History Museum, and you can see them in the exhibit over there, which is wonderful. This is Fred's actual wallet. This is a picture that's on the back of Fred's business card. So if you think business cards with pictures on them are a new thing, Fred Harvey had one in 1865. This is another picture of Fred during this time. And we have actually a lot of Fred's date books from this time period. He was selling tickets and selling freight for the railroads. Now, as a biographer, it would have been great if his date books were full of really deep psychological details that would really help me flesh out his character. But Fred Harvey was a business guy. Most of what's in his date books are how much money people owe him, how much money he owes to people, what deals he has made. He also kept pretty good track of his sleeping patterns, which actually gave us a pretty good idea of what his health was like, which wasn't always great. And in fact, the fact that Fred Harvey was not a very healthy guy is probably part of the reason he later created a hospitality empire that was based on comfort, because he had so many bad train rides, so many bad hotels. We have lots of his letters that he wrote home. This is the earliest one from 1869. Again, these are all in the museum now. And basically, for the next decade, Fred Harvey worked for the railroads, first as a ticket agent in Leavenworth, and then taking the trains all over the country, wherever they expanded west, and also to the east, selling freight as a freight agent for the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad, and also selling ads for different newspapers. He was just a great salesman and great at going into a town and figuring out what people in different businesses needed. Because if you were a freight agent, you showed up in a town that maybe never had trains before, and then you had to meet with people who were miners, you had to meet with people who were farmers, you had to meet with people who had different things they wanted to ship to different places, and you needed to understand their business, you needed to understand what they needed. Fred was great at that. But he always wanted to get back into the restaurant business. So this is his wallet from 1875, and we can see that he cut out of the newspaper maxims for businessmen, and he pasted it into his wallet. And I made a PowerPoint out of these maxims for businessmen because they're kind of cool. One of my favorite is number 3, law is a trade in which lawyers eat the oysters and leave the clients the shells. But if you look down at the bottom, you'll see the things that Fred really led his life by. Be silent when a fool talks. And Rothschild, the founder of the world-renowned House of Rothschild, described his success to the following: never have anything to do with an unlucky man, be cautious and bold, and make a bargain at once. And what Fred decided to do later in his life, he was almost 40, which by that time, that's midlife for us, that's end of life in 1865, decided that he would go back into the restaurant business. He made a deal with a hotel manager that he knew in Leavenworth, and they took over 3 eating houses on what became the Union Pacific Railroad branch in Kansas. And these are some of his things that they needed for the hotel. He would make lots of lists. We learned about Fred a lot from his lists. So this is from his place in Wallace, Kansas. There was a later one in Wallace, New Mexico. Neither of these towns exist at all anymore. So some of the things about these railroad towns is that they were popular at the time, and some of them just didn't make it. So Fred first had this deal. He hated working with his partner. He hated working with that railroad. He met people from the Atchison, Topeka, Santa Fe Railroad, which at that time went basically from Atchison to Topeka. So the way you name a railroad is you put down a few tracks between a few towns that help pay you for the tracks, and then you get a land grant to get you to like the Pacific or to Mexico or something, and you pray that you can be in business long enough for that to happen. So that's what the Atchison, Topeka, Santa Fe was then. But they did get as far as Topeka. They needed a restaurant in Topeka, and Fred made a deal with them to take over the lunchroom there, and his deal was that he wouldn't pay any rent, he wouldn't pay any utilities, his employees would travel for free, and he would keep all the profits, and his employees, the railroad passengers always got priority. So if people in Topeka were eating lunch and the train pulled in, they stopped eating lunch. And the people from the train got off and they ate lunch because they were the priority because the railroad was paying for it. And then the people got back in the train and then people started their lunch again. And this is actually something that always happened in the Fred Harvey restaurants that you rarely hear about, but when people write about it, sometimes they still admit that that's what happened to them. So Fred took over the Topeka house. These are all the things he wanted for that house. And you can see he's very ambitious. I mean, he was bringing stuff from England. He's bringing stuff from France. He wanted these places to be these beautiful oases. This restaurant was somewhat successful. It was a small lunchroom. And then he had the opportunity to take over the restaurant in this town. And you can see this is the kind of place that you would want to invest all your money because obviously the gourmets there really are going to be happy with it. This is Florence, Kansas. And back there is the old Atchison Topeka Santa Fe Hotel. Fred was offered the opportunity to take that over. He took the opportunity, he invested every penny that he had, and he hired the chef and general manager from the Palmer House in Chicago, which was then one of the biggest hotels in the world. He was also British, William Phillips, and he came down, and they created a restaurant that became an international sensation. And we know about this because actually it was covered in the newspapers in England. There were British writers who were coming to America to see what America was like, and one of them wrote all about these two British guys who would open this hotel in the middle of nowhere where you could eat all the bounty of America, which British people were fascinated by, all the game that we had that they didn't have, all the fish we had, but prepared in the British style, in the continental style. And so this place, which became the Clifton Hotel, became hugely successful, and Fred started making a lot of money. He still had his full-time job with the railroads. This was all being done on the side. But now that he was making money with it, he invested some. He invested in cattle, and he owned the XY Cattle Ranch, which was in southwestern Kansas. Literary people are interested in this because part of his land at this time was where the Clutter Farm was. Do you guys remember the Clutter Farm? Did you read In Cold Blood? So Fred Harvey owned the land that became the Clutter Farm, where those people were murdered that Truman Capote went and wrote about. But he became pretty successful in the cattle business. And this is what he looked like during this time, as sort of a nouveau riche guy. His wife was also nouveau riche in Leavenworth. She didn't travel with him very much, but she stayed at home, and she played a lot of euchre, which is a card game which you're not supposed to really gamble, but I think they gambled quite a lot. And her euchre games were so popular, they were actually covered in the sports pages in Leavenworth. So she was home raising their kids. They had 5 children. And Fred was always on the road. So his company expanded from Topeka to Lake in Kansas, into Colorado. And then we get to the part of the story that you guys care about. And that is the part that has to do with New Mexico. So these are, see, this is a nice little graphic my intern made. I don't know how exactly she did it, but so you can see that in the middle of 1879, the railroad came over the Raton Pass and started coming into New Mexico, and very quickly connected Las Vegas, Lamy, see, Albuquerque, and now you understand that it did not connect Santa Fe. So at this point, Santa Fe, which was the cornerstone of the Santa Fe Trail, was no longer on the main line of the railroad. This changed Santa Fe forever. Some people think that it saved Santa Fe. At the time, people did not think it saved Santa Fe. They were really not happy about this. But the railroad continued Albuquerque, San Marcial, which no longer exists. It was wiped out by a flood. Rincon, Las Cruces, and then it connected west from Rincon and Deming and east from El Paso. And then during this time, they also opened the Montezuma Hotel in Las Vegas. Is that the end of the graphic? Yes. So in order to do this, Fred came into Las Vegas. The company bought the land that became the Montezuma Hotel in the Hot Springs. In the interim, they brought, as you can see from this article, they brought a railroad car in and set it up as a restaurant along the side of the tracks, which is what Fred Harvey often did before they could actually get a restaurant set up. But in the meantime, they were building what became the first Montezuma Hotel, which would be the cornerstone of the Santa Fe Railroad's business in New Mexico. It was a health resort, and obviously health tourism was becoming a really big thing. It opened in 1882. It was a huge success, got incredible press, brought Fred Harvey international renown, but it really was not successful as a hotel because people heard there were sick people there, and they didn't want to stay at a hotel where sick people were. So, and there was articles in the paper how, I can't go to that hotel. I heard there are people there without noses, one of the articles said. So it was a white elephant for the railroad, and even though this is not easy for all the docents in Las Vegas who've been telling people for years that Fred Harvey was at the Montezuma for many, many years, Fred Harvey Company ran the Montezuma literally for a year. And this article from the Optic, as you can see, shows that Fred Harvey is no longer the buyer of the supplies used at the hotel. And by the time the Montezuma burned down in 1884, Fred was ready to be done. And the railroad ran it. And what Fred Harvey realized was that the small trackside hotels that became the cornerstone of Fred Harvey was really what his business was going to be, and not big places like this. So they didn't have them again for years. It was also during this time that the Harvey Girls were created. So the Harvey Girls were created in Raton, New Mexico in 1883. There was a big problem in New Mexico. New Mexico had no female waitresses except for in the brothels. The waiters were all African-American men, and a lot of the cowboys who were in New Mexico had been on the wrong side of the Civil War, and so there was a lot of racial tension in a lot of these restaurants. Some of the Fred Harvey black waiters had to carry guns to protect themselves against their customers. So after one more racial incident at the Raton Harvey house, Fred decided they needed to make a change, and he just so happened that his next-door neighbor from Leavenworth, a guy named Tom Gable, happened to be visiting, and they had a conversation about what to do, and Tom Gable suggested that they start hiring women from the Midwest and bring them out and put them in these restaurants instead. So Fred put him in charge of the restaurant, and the Harvey girls began in Raton, and over a period of time became what was known for the Fred Harvey Company. So it was very unusual to have only women, and they were all centrally hired, which was actually a huge big deal at the time, because basically any restaurant you ate at in the country, you were waited on by people who lived in the town. But Fred Harvey didn't want to be beholden to only the people who lived in these towns. A lot of these towns were tiny. So they started hiring people in the Midwest and training them in the Midwest and then sending them to their different locations. The Harvey girls became a huge phenomenon. These are some of the pictures that we've gathered over the years from them, but as you know, there's now a documentary about the Harvey girls. There's an oral history project about the Harvey girls. We're really learning a lot about the Harvey girls that we didn't know. And these are just some of the pictures that we've captured over the years. That's from Grand Canyon, from Chicago. This is Harvey girl art. This is one of my favorites that was done for the Harvey girls movie. This Harvey girls figurines. This is actually one of the only Harvey girl pictures you ever see with a guy. Because part of the whole Harvey girl thing, the reason they dressed them like nuns with bow ties, was because they didn't want people to think, waitresses didn't have the best reputation in the world back then. The Harvey waitresses didn't want to be seen as what they were, which is the only single women in town. And when one of them got married, another single woman came in to replace them. So they were never photographed with men. But the Harvey girl legend began. About 100,000 women had the experience of being Harvey girls from the 1880s through the 1940s. In the 1940s, the system changed because they could no longer centrally hire, and they started hiring Harvey girls who lived in the cities they lived in. So for the next 30 years of Harvey girls, they were mostly local. But from the 1880s through the war, they were hired centrally in Chicago and then brought to the different places. There were also, of course, millions of Harvey guys, but you never hear anybody romantic. There's never been a Harvey guy movie. Maybe there will be someday. But the Harvey Company had a huge number of chefs, of busboys. It really was America's culinary institute before there were culinary institutes. And they trained an enormous number of chefs who were brought over from Europe, and they trained an enormous number of America's restaurant and hotel managers. Most of that was not done by Fred Harvey. One of the great things about Fred Harvey that you learned about him as a businessman was he was not Donald Trump. He was not a megalomaniac who needed credit for everything. In fact, he liked it when other people had good ideas, and he wanted to go with them. His number two man was a guy named David Benjamin, a Jewish immigrant from England, who had been his bank teller in Leavenworth. And it started out as his accountant, and in the 1880s was basically elevated to take over the company. And as an accountant, he was very interested in systems. And because they had so many employees in so many different places, and of course this is before phones, so these are all being done by telegraph, they had systems in place so there was a right way to do everything within Fred Harvey. And David Benjamin was the architect of that. So by 1884, Fred had 12 trackside eating houses in Kansas, Colorado, and New Mexico. The railroad only went to the end of New Mexico. A different railroad took you from Arizona to California at that point. He was personally earning the equivalent of $1.1 million a year of pure profit because there were no taxes then. And the company was run from a small office in Kansas City Union Depot, which was the depot before Union Station. And it was part of the reason this was such a great partnership between the Santa Fe and Fred Harvey is that, what is your idea of the worst big business that exists today, the most hated big business? Walmart, pharmaceuticals, whatever your most hated business is. So at that time, the most hated business was railroads. I mean, the railroad companies were bigger than the US government at this point. They were the largest companies in the world. So people didn't love them. So Fred Harvey was like a warm and fuzzy way to be taken care of by the railroad. And so it was very important for them to brand all the eating houses with Fred Harvey because that was something that people saw as a positive thing. And also the places that were such high standards, and everybody quickly found out about it. So as I told you, David Benjamin made lots of lists of rules so that people would always do things the Harvey way. This is actually one of the earliest lists that came from, we found it in one of the Harvey chefs' recipe books, and I made a PowerPoint out of it. It's really interesting considering this comes from the 1880s. things that you would expect, courtesy and smile paid dividends. But think about this. Number 8, real services without discrimination. You're talking about a company that was going through many Jim Crow states. It was really important to them that they were racially diverse and that they did the right thing in that area. Preserve or create, never destroy. This was a company 100 years before anybody talked about environmental issues in their restaurant. They were already thinking about this. Tact is an asset and honesty is still a virtue. So in the 1880s, they were already worried that honesty was no longer a virtue. And the Harvey way for everything. Fred knew every morning by telegram how many eggs, cigars, and everything were consumed at each of his houses. There were rules. The best known is, do you guys know about the Harvey Cup Code? So some of you don't. So in order to make the food service as quick as possible, the Harvey girls were told that you took your drink order and you put your cup in whatever position the drink order was, and then the person pouring would know. So one position was water, one position was coffee. There was 3 different positions for different kinds of tea, and 1 position for milk. And that way they could take seconds off, because keep in mind, they were trying to get you in the restaurant, served a full 4-course meal, and out back into the train in 30 minutes. That's what the railroad demanded of them. The recipes were standardized, but the menus were fixed, unlike our chain restaurants of today, so that when you were going along the line, you would have different food offered to you in different places. They knew you were going to be on a long train ride. They knew you weren't going to want to eat the same thing everywhere you went. And they would change the recipes so that when you got on in California, you'd be eating meat that came from Chicago. When you got on in Chicago, you'd be eating fresh fish that came from the Pacific Ocean, to prove how great the railroads were and all the cool things that they could do. The chefs were also entrepreneurial, and they would buy things from local farmers, buy things from local ranchers, and then send them along the line. There was a locked refrigerator car that went back and forth between the Harvey locations that only the chefs had a key to open, and that way they would be able to send things along. So into all this comes Fred Harvey's son, Ford, who was his oldest son, was in college, and was told when he was in the second year of college that he had to leave college to come home and start learning the family business. And he reluctantly did so because his father was not necessarily in great health. So the irony is that Fred Harvey, the more successful he was, the less healthy he was. Today, we would say that Fred Harvey had a combination of gastrointestinal issues, which later led to him having colon cancer, and clearly either depression or manic depression. It's very clear that he was suffering from some kind of mood disorder. At that time, he was diagnosed with the pop diagnosis of the day, which was Americanitis. So Americanitis was an actual medical diagnosis. There were books about it by actual doctors, and it was basically a disease of the rich that was caused by the pressures of being successful in America. And the only way to treat Americanitis was to leave America. So Fred Harvey started spending half the year in England, sitting in a hotel room or sitting at his sister's house, waiting until he would feel better, which he honestly rarely did. He would telegram home. He stayed involved in the business. All the major decisions were made with him, but he was away. After doing this for 2 or 3 years, the railroad suddenly got the opportunity to expand all the way to California. So in 1887, the railroad connected with the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad at the Arizona border and extended all the way to California. And the Fred Harvey Company had to take over all those eating houses and doubled in size overnight. That's really when the Harvey girls exploded, because they went from 12 houses with Harvey girls to 25 houses with Harvey girls, and they really had to hire a lot of people. It's also when the Fred Harvey Company really expanded. Expanded mostly under David Benjamin, who we met before, and Ford, and David Benjamin and Ford worked together and ran the business under Fred's supervision. What you never hear in this whole story, because the Santa Fe Railroad always told the story, is that the Fred Harvey Company and the Santa Fe Railroad then fell out of love. And in fact, the Santa Fe Railroad tried to fire Fred Harvey in the late 1880s and the early 1890s. Fred's friend, William Strong, who had been the president of the railroad, was forced out. He gave Fred a contract right before he left, and those 5 years were a ticking time bomb for the company. And when they're getting toward the end of the 5 years, the railroad started trying to put dining cars on the line and close the Harvey houses. So Fred Harvey sued the railroad in Chicago. Now, you have to remember that Fred Harvey had given out an enormous number of free passes to judges, politicians, and other people over the years to curry favor with all the people that he needed to do business with. So it is unsurprising that Fred Harvey won this lawsuit, which would be basically like Jenny's napkin provider, taking down, the entire empire of La Fonda and 10 other restaurants. But that's what in fact happened. Luckily for us, the lawsuit laid out a lot of documents that we didn't know before, so we get to know exactly what was going on in the company at this point. So the lawsuit happened. These two companies were duking it out. They were waiting to see what was going to happen when the 5 years ran out. And then the country had a depression in 1893, which you probably never have heard of. But it was actually much worse than the depression in the 1930s. And basically every big company went out of business. Every company went bankrupt, including the Santa Fe Railroad. And the receivers of the Santa Fe Railroad could not afford to fire Fred Harvey, because basically that meant they would have to pay for the food and serve the food themselves, and they couldn't do that. So Fred Harvey was saved, and the new management that came in decided they loved Fred Harvey, and they really wanted to do everything differently. So the new company was, when the railroad changed over, Ford was in charge. This is a good picture of Ford. This is Ford and his wife. And they basically rebooted the company. Ford took over the business. Fred was encouraged that it was time for him to step down. His health was really not great by this point. They made a new deal that instead of getting all the profits, they split the profits. They added dining cars and retail, and the Fred Harvey became a huge retail company. The railroad started building these new, bigger hotels, which we talked about, and Fred started taking over these Union stations. And Fred Harvey then became a brand, not a person. They took his signature and made it into a brand name. And they started signing everything Fred Harvey, even though he hadn't signed it. And they started putting on all the materials. Your host is Fred Harvey. By this time, Fred Harvey was quite ill. They were planning for what would happen after he would die. This is really the beginning of branding in America. This is before Coca-Cola. So this had not been done before. It's actually pretty common now. So, as I said, dining cars, Union stations, and the retail business. The middle here is Minnie Harvey, who was Ford Harvey's sister. And she married a guy named John Huckle, who was in the publishing business in New York. And he was brought back to the company, to Kansas City, to take over their new retail business, which was partly about books and magazines, but also partly about having retail for customers who were on the trains. But also, the new train stations were becoming like the new malls. They were really the first covered shopping centers. So John Huckle and Minnie, who could not be an officer of the company because she was a girl, but Minnie really understood the business, and she would send messages to her brother through her husband, John Huckle. And so they built this great retail business. Each of the train stations not only had restaurants, they had cigar stores. Cigars were more important than money at this time, by the way. It's really amazing. Certainly more important than food. They had barbershops. They had men and women's clothing stores. They had perfume stores. They had drug stores. They had, for authors, we all love this, 24-hour bookshops that delivered in the cities, but also would deliver a book ahead of you when you were traveling, so it would be in your hotel room when you got to the next place. It's a dream. Unfortunately, Fred did not get to enjoy much of this dream. He was really ill. He went to England for surgery. He came back. He hung on to life for a number of years. This is the last picture that was taken of him in his study in Leavenworth. But he died in 1901 after a very difficult illness. And he left this very creative will, which I believe is not legal today. But back then, he left a will that said that no one could admit he was dead for the next 10 years. No one could have any of his money for the next 10 years. No one could change anything about how his business ran for the next 10 years. If his kids didn't like it, they could get jobs. But he wanted to make sure that the Fred Harvey name, the Fred Harvey brand, was continued beyond this. And so his company was locked. His son Ford, who was, of course, running the company and couldn't kind of admit it because they still had to say Fred Harvey was running everything, did this. Interesting father-son issue. I'm all about father-son issues in books, so there's a lot of father-son stuff about that. And in this situation, Ford expanded into the Southwest. Most of the things that we love about the Fred Harvey Company actually were done by Ford, even though he was sort of pretending he was still Fred. So the first thing that happened under Ford was they were expanding the train line to the Grand Canyon. They started building in the Southwest. So only the Castaneda was built during Fred's life. The Alvarado, which was much bigger because Albuquerque was was basically the center of the entire Western operation, was built. These are some pictures of the Alvarado, the poor late. How many of you went to the Alvarado before they knocked it down? It is like the worst thing if they knocked the Alvarado down. So they were building the Alvarado, and in 1901, they finished the Grand Canyon Railroad. This is the first train to come to the Grand Canyon. And it was decided that the leadership of the Santa Fe Railroad and Ford Harvey would take a journey. And they would journey through the Southwest in a way that no one really ever had before. So they got on the train. They went to all the places that we now take for granted. They went to Acoma. They went to all the different pueblos that we go to. This is them out in the wilderness. They were roughing it. But here's how they were roughing it. The guides would come and set up the tents for them the day before. Hundreds of Native Americans would escort them everywhere. It was like a very high-end camping trip for, these people were the leaders of the largest company in the world. But they roughed it through the Southwest, and they ended up at the edge of the Grand Canyon. That's Ford on the left at the edge of the Grand Canyon, discussing where the Fred Harvey Hotel there would be built. As you know, for those of you who've been to El Tovar, it's kind of a weird shape. And it doesn't really make any sense. And the reason it doesn't make any sense is because when it was originally designed, it hung out over the edge of the Grand Canyon. And during this discussion, they had a big argument. This is Charles Loomis on the right, who was a major advocate of the Southwest, a major writer, and a friend of Teddy Roosevelt, his roommate from college. So he sicked Teddy Roosevelt on them, saying, you cannot build a hotel out over the edge of the Grand Canyon. And finally, Teddy Roosevelt convinced them not to, so that's why El Tovar has like a porch that should overlook the Grand Canyon. It kind of doesn't. So the company got into the Southwest. They were going to start at the Grand Canyon, and John Huckle and Minnie Huckle, who we met before, were really interested in curios. They were the people in the family who came to Santa Fe, who bought Native American art, who did, what all you guys did the first time you came to Santa Fe. You come, you have turquoise in your eyes, you can't wait to buy a lot of belts and necklaces. And they realized there were going to be people like them who came to the Southwest. So they wanted to start what they thought would be a museum. And they started it with this gentleman. This gentleman's name is Herman Schweitzer. He was the manager at the Gallup Harvey House. And in his free time, he would ride up into the Navajo reservation and trade with Navajo craftsmen. And he collected authentic Navajo jewelry and Navajo art. But he also was encouraging the Navajo craftsmen who were down on their luck. I mean, America had, of course, ruined their entire economic system. To also create lighter jewelry, which we think of as Navajo light jewelry, with lighter silver, and he would even bring them smaller pieces of turquoise than they were used to using, to create the trinket business. And while I'm looking around here, most of you have fairly authentic things on, the bigger, heavier things. The truth is that all the lighter jewelry that you buy is not originally authentic design. Most of it was designed by Herman Schweitzer, and it became fabulously successful. So what Schweitzer did was both create a smaller, more portable jewelry business. And at the same time, the Harvey Company saved all the Native American art because they created a museum and they bought up every collection and they encouraged all the original artisans to continue their work. This work was dovetailed with Mary Coulter. So most people know Mary Coulter and don't know Herman Schweitzer. But of course, Herman Schweitzer hired Mary Coulter. Schweitzer had already begun this work with the Huckles. They brought in Mary Coulter from Minnesota. She was an industrial designer, and they brought her in to design these 3 rooms at the Alvarado, which were in between the train station and the hotel, which became known as the Indian Building. Now, part of the problem was there was very little space here. So most of you know that most of this Native American art would be found in a much more spare house if it was actually in a Native American's house. But Mary Coulter didn't have that kind of room, and she came from the retail business. So she crammed as many things as she could into each room so you could see them. And then she invented what we now call Santa Fe style. And it was really just supposed to be a display idea, but when people walked into the room, they said, I want my house to look like that. And now all your houses look like that. And so people would come in and buy whole rooms. So suddenly this museum that was supposed to be this static thing was a business. And they had to keep buying more and more Native art, commissioning more and more Native art. And it became a very popular thing to go to the Indian Building and buy materials from the Fred Harvey Indians, because on top of hiring artisans, they hired artisans to be Indians and make art in front of the building so the people on the trains could see Indians during their 30-minute meal stop. And it became hugely, hugely popular. Now keep in mind that the Alvarado was also the only way to get to California. So when the movie business started in Hollywood, everybody who was going to make movies in Hollywood stopped at the Alvarado, which is where the first place most directors who wanted to make Westerns first saw an Indian. They saw Fred Harvey Indians weaving stuff on the trackside. So all the movie stars wanted to be filmed, had their pictures taken with the Fred Harvey Indians. And starting in 1912, they started making movies there. So the first one was called The Tourists. It's a short. Tourists come to the Alvarado and they miss their train. They're aghast, of course. And what happens is that the women are kidnapped by the male Native Americans. And then the female Indians, the Indian suffragettes, if you will, were on the warpath because the men had kidnapped the women, and they told them that if they didn't let the women go, well, you know how that goes. So they let them go, and they waved goodbye, and everybody lived happily ever after 8 minutes later. And that's the first Western that was shot at the Alvarado. But mostly what we know from the Alvarado is the beginning of the cult of Mary Coulter, who came, worked at the Alvarado, went back to Minnesota, and didn't work for the Fred Harvey Company for a number of years after. She did that as a freelance job. But she was brought back in 1904 when they were building El Tovar and building across from it Hopi House. And Hopi House was an actual Indian building that she built from scratch, completely fake, but completely authentic at the same time. And Mary Coulter's idea was that you would have these sort of permanent World's Fair exhibit places that would allow you to see the culture that you were not going to be able to get to if you had to go too far from the train. So we know the company is growing at leaps and bounds. This is how much stuff they were using every year at this time. That is a lot of eggs. And 150,000 pounds of lard is a lot of lard any way you look at it. Ford was still pretty quiet in all this. He was becoming a big deal in Kansas City, but he still was not the national figure that became known. But he eventually, after 10 years, his father's will could be put out, and Ford could be a more public person. He became better known in Kansas City. He was one of the receivers for the light rail line when it went out of business, and he got involved in the building of the Union Station. And he had his own maxims for businessmen, which he put together some from his dad. So they were always promote from with your own ranks. Fred Harvey people never hired middle managers from other companies. They hired raw people who knew nothing about their jobs so they could be trained the way they wanted to train them. They gradually and steadily expand. Always please the cranks. That was Fred Harvey's motto. It's easy to make a big deal about people who love your restaurant. It's the people who hate your guts, who think you did a terrible job, who you really have to please. And never take yourself too damn seriously. And that's really what Ford was all about. And he had big plans for this company. And again, most of the things we love about Fred Harvey, Ford did with Mary Coulter, with Herman Schweitzer, with John Huckle. Including in 1912, when the City Beautiful movement began in Santa Fe, the hope was that one of the cornerstones of it would be a new Fred Harvey hotel. So we found this article in the New Mexican, January 4th, 1912, where they were begging the Fred Harvey Company to open a hotel in Santa Fe, which they had not. They had a little hotel in Lamy, but the Fred Harvey Company did not open then. They expanded into Kansas City Union Station, which is a beautiful building. And then in 1915, there was a great meeting of the minds of all the people in the West who were interested in tourism. There were two World's Fairs. There was one in San Francisco, and there was one in San Diego. And the San Diego World's Fair was really where what we consider the Fred Harvey Southwest really came together. They built a pueblo in San Diego where they moved Native Americans who lived in this area to live for a year. And this is when most Americans found out about the Grand Canyon, when most Americans found out about Santa Fe. And keep in mind, it's 1914. The war in Europe had already started, so all rich people couldn't go to Europe anymore. So America as a destination had its first big draw in 1915. And that's when a lot of the things that happened in Santa Fe came together, because many people from Santa Fe, Edgar Hewitt, Jesse Nussbaum, all these people that you always hear about, they were all out there working with the Fred Harvey Company and sort of creating a lot of the ideas that would then become the cornerstones of life in Santa Fe. This is also when Maria Martinez, the famous potter who rediscovered black-on-black pottery that we all now love, was working for the Fred Harvey Company as one of the Fred Harvey Indians at the World's Fair exhibit in San Diego. And the Grand Canyon got a huge amount of people coming at that point. And this is really when the National Park Service came together, because it became very clear that you couldn't just let private people run these places anymore. So the Park Service came together at this time. Ford Harvey was one of the cornerstones of the Park Service because the Grand Canyon was the biggest national park, even before it was named a park. Ford had two kids who he hoped would go in the business and take it over. Kitty, who was his oldest, did not work in the business formally because, of course, she was a girl. Ironically, the company of Harvey Girls didn't let girls in upper management except Mary Coulter. Kitty was openly gay. It was a big socialite in Kansas City and Chicago. This is her playing baseball at Indian Gardens with her friends at the Grand Canyon. But her younger brother, Freddie, was the heir apparent. He was a World War I pilot, pretty much of a daredevil in a lot of ways in his life. And he was going to take over with his sister. They were going to be the next generation of Fred Harvey. And what they were thinking about after the First World War, and the railroads, were federalized briefly. So the government took over all the railroads and closed some of them and let them reopen. But that was kind of the beginning of the end for the railroads because it was very clear that there didn't need to be multiple stations and multiple railroads to different cities. So they were starting to think about cars because people were starting to go across the country in cars. And they were also investing in the tourism businesses. And Freddie, who was a pilot, believed in the air. And he believed that planes would be the next way that people got involved here. And so he was partners in Transcontinental Air Transport, which was the first cross-country airline. And the Indian Detours was based here in Santa Fe, which is why they expanded La Fonda. And people would take trips like this. And actually, the graphics for these things are all really cool. These are all from the New Mexico History Museum exhibit. These are just scenes from the Indian Detours, which started at Las Vegas at one end and at the Grand Canyon at the other end. Depending on what you wanted, you saw whatever amount of the Southwest you wanted and the number of days that you had. These are the Indian Detours couriers. You recognize this scene. It's right around the corner. And the Detours couriers were different than Harvey girls. They were educated. They were college girls because they actually had to give lectures on Native American history, on the geography and geology. And this is Freddie Harvey putting the first spade in for the expansion of La Fonda Hotel in the 1920s. And the first great chef here was named Conrad Algier. This is a picture of him. He was, a lot of the dishes that you eat here, the La Fonda pudding, La Fonda chicken, were all invented by him. He was a German chef who had worked for Kaiser Wilhelm and came over and ran La Fonda. He also was an unbelievable ice sculptor, of ice sculptures that were, I have to say, some of them were kind of hallucinogenic. But he was well known. And this is when you guys recognize this is the restaurant now, but this used to be the outdoor cafe. So the Indian Detours brought thousands and thousands of people to the Southwest to experience the Southwest tourism that you guys all love today. And then in 1929, they started Transcontinental Air Transport. So at this time, there were no commercial airlines. Planes didn't have lights, and airports didn't have lights. So in order for planes to cut your flying time, you got in a plane, you went until it was dark, you landed, you went in a train, and then you got back in a plane. So Transcontinental Air Transport, which was a combination of all the big industrialists of the day and Freddie Harvey himself, because the Santa Fe wouldn't invest in another form of transportation. Part of the reason the railroads went down, ultimately, was because they saw themselves as being in the train business, not in the transportation business. So when they had the opportunity to invest in cars, they didn't. When they had the opportunity to own airlines, they didn't. And that's why eventually those other forms of transportation destroyed their business. So Transcontinental Air Transport, you got on a plane, you got on a train in New York City, and you took an overnight train ride to Columbus, Ohio, because no one wanted to fly over the Allegheny Mountains because they were like the Bermuda Triangle of flying. You then took a plane from Columbus, Ohio to Waynoka, Oklahoma, which was a Fred Harvey city, and you had a Fred Harvey dinner. You then took an overnight train from Waynoka to Clovis, New Mexico, where you had a Fred Harvey breakfast and got on another plane to Winslow, Arizona, where there was an airport and you had another Fred Harvey meal, and then you took the train to Los Angeles. And by doing this, you took a whole day off getting across the country, so it only took 2 days instead of 3 days to get from New York to Los Angeles. And this is the route. So Freddie Harvey was in charge of all the food on these planes, and this was like a pretty challenging thing because, of course, the windows opened on the planes. So it's a lot harder to serve food on a plane when you can open the windows. And the planes weren't pressurized, so occasionally people would, bleed from the ears or like throw up or something bad like that. But, it was the original thing. Now you see here, this is a gentleman doing this, but they quickly figured out that there should be women on the planes modeled after the Harvey girls, and the first airline attendants, the first stewardesses, were basically the Harvey girls of the air. So the company was poised to really do great things in the airlines. They were setting up along Route 66, and everything was great. And then Ford Harvey got the flu and dropped dead in 6 days. And unlike his father, who left the most elaborate will you could possibly think of, Ford had not updated his will, and it did not make clear how the company was supposed to proceed without him. His children inherited all the stock, but his younger brother Byron, who'd been waiting his turn in the company for like 25 years, he wanted to run the company, and so the two factions of the company in Chicago and Kansas City were kind of competing against each other. Minnie Harvey, who loved dogs, was sort of stuck in the middle of all this, trying to keep her nephew and niece and her brother from warring. And you can see how well they were doing. I found this picture in their family photo album. And This was not a great time to have a family fight because, of course, it was 1929. And like some other things happened that year that would put pressures on any American company. But interestingly, the Fred Harvey Company and the Santa Fe Railroad pushed on as if the Depression was not going to affect them. And for those of all you who love La Posada, you'd be amazed to know that they built La Posada after the Depression had already started. They could have pulled the plug on it, but they continued to build it. It cost $1 million in 1930. And if you've been there, it's a very odd, wonderful place, very risky thing to build. But they built that then. They also went on to build the Watchtower, which is arguably the coolest thing at the Grand Canyon, maybe the coolest building in the West. And Mary Coulter designed that. During this time, Mary Coulter also designed Membreno China. And for those of you, do you guys know about Membreno China? So Membreno China was created for the Super Chief, unbelievably wonderful. Went so you couldn't find it anymore. Copies were made. They kind of got crummy. If you haven't heard the good news, a new company is going to be copying the Membreno China. It's going to be available this spring. It's really great looking. We saw a couple pieces of it the other day. The Super Chief was also created during this time. So the railroad was still investing. The Fred Harvey Company was still investing, even though they were starting to close some of the smaller locations. The Fred Harvey Company withdrew from Texas altogether from the places on the Frisco Railroad. They opened Bright Angel Lodge during this time, and they were hoping to make it through the Depression and rebuild. And then Freddie Harvey crashed his plane. And Freddie Harvey was a very reckless flyer. He was bringing his wife and their dog back from New York City. He was stopped right before the Alleghenies. And keep in mind, he was one of the board of directors of TWA, so he had pretty good access to weather reports. They said to him, do not fly now, it's too dangerous. He said, I'm sure it'll be fine, I'm a really good flyer, I'll do it. And this is the result. So not only was this a horrible tragedy for the Fred Harvey Company, but it was a huge setback for American aviation because one of the board of directors of the biggest airline in the country had just crashed and killed himself. The company was inherited by his sister Kitty. And while she had not been active in the business, she had been a big collector. She was known to know the business really well. And all the bankers in Kansas City thought she would do a great job running the company. But her uncle would not allow it. And he forced her to sell her shares out in 1937 so that the company could move to Chicago. So she took her money, and she and her girlfriend, Mary Perkins, who was the daughter of another big railroad magnate, lived their lives in California, doing great philanthropy, great collecting. There's actually still many charities that they started there. And the company was moved to Chicago, and Byron Harvey, Ford's younger brother, and his 3 sons took over the business. And they were the only ones in the family that had kids. So all the Harveys that we know today are the Byron Harveys. They are wonderful people. Many of them are here this weekend. They did one more big project together, which was LA Union Station. This is the room that Mary Coulter designed at that station. It's the biggest Navajo rug ever. It's the size of a football field. It's made out of cut linoleum. That was made in 1939. It hasn't been repaired once. It's in beautiful condition. This building hasn't been used in a long time. It's actually going to be reopened as a restaurant this year, which is very cool. And the company probably would have gotten smaller and smaller and smaller. Then the war came. So they reopened all the Harvey restaurants. And in Santa Fe, it was particularly interesting because Robert Oppenheimer and all the scientists who came to work at Los Alamos considered La Fonda to be their clubhouse. And people came and stayed here before they went up in the hill. Whenever anything good or bad happened during the Manhattan Project, people came here to celebrate. There are great wild stories about the spies in La Fonda and Oppenheimer sending his secretary down to make up stories that the spies would hear so they would think that America was working on something else. It's an incredibly romantic time. Someday, somebody will make a movie about La Fonda in the 1940s, I believe, because it's like much better than Casablanca, but has all the Casablanca stuff. So it's not surprising that at the same time, at the height of Fred Harvey Company's fame, that the Harvey Girls movie would be made. This is one of my favorite stills from the Harvey Girls movie. The Harvey Girls movie is one of the biggest movies in its day of all time. The ad campaign for it was unbelievable. It was all part of this post-war elation. The truth is the song on the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe was the most popular song in America when World War II ended. It was number 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, different versions of the song on the top 10. This is a picture of Elizabeth Taylor holding Fred Harvey chocolates, which is part of the endless array of products that were done during this time. And as I said, instead of the company expanding, it contracted. It became this. They focused on the Grand Canyon. They bought the buildings from the Grand Canyon. For some of you who've been following the recent contract disputes between Xanterra and the National Park Service, this all goes back to when Fred Harvey bought the buildings at the Grand Canyon. And Xanterra obviously still owns the Fred Harvey things. La Fonda continued until 1968 and was sold to the Ballin family. Kitty Harvey lived a wonderful life of a collector. She died in 1962. The Fred Harvey Company was sold out to what became Xanterra in 1968. And at that time, they abandoned some of the other buildings, including the Alvarado. And in 1970, the Alvarado became the subject of one of the biggest preservation battles in the country, which was lost. Unbelievably painful. This is what the Alvarado looked like when they knocked it down. And then, of course, the irony was that they went around and built a bus station that looks like a really bad, blurry replica of the Alvarado. So what can you say? What was left of the company at this time was its art collection, which Herman Schweitzer and the people beyond him had always kept from being sold. The family had a foundation to preserve it, and that material was donated to the Heard Museum in Phoenix, which also mounted the first big Fred Harvey campaign and the first big Fred Harvey show in the 1990s. And in the late 80s and early 1990s, you started to see people who were interested in bringing the Fred Harvey story back. So some of you guys know Maureen McMillan, who ran the Belen Harvey House for decades. She was one of the first people to sort of get people to pay attention to bringing these Harvey houses back to life, paying attention to the Harvey stories. And then Alan Affeld and his wife Tina Mione bought in the mid-1990s La Posada and very openly brought it back to life. And while bringing it back to life, retold the story of Mary Coulter and Fred Harvey to a whole new generation. They recently bought the Castaneda Hotel, which we're very excited about. And here's Jenny. Hi, Jenny. So here in Santa Fe, it was interesting because the Ballin family were not that into the Fred Harvey thing, but there were still a lot of staff here that were. And you actually had that at the Grand Canyon too, where there were a lot of Fred heads who'd been working there longer than the people who owned the place and who loved the Harvey legends, even though the management wasn't so into it. So when I started first meeting all these people, you had people like Jenny and people who worked for her who got the Fred Harvey thing, but it wasn't as big a part of what their lives could be. But what's been interesting is that since then, the Fred heads have sort of won. So they won here. They won at the Grand Canyon. Alan Affeld and Tina Mione bought other places. And what looked like a lost legend is really now a vibrant part of living history. We're finding new old things about Fred Harvey and Mary Coulter and the Santa Fe Railroad and the time periods in New Mexico and Arizona and all over the country that they give us access to every day. So it's a very exciting time to be a docent in this area because honestly, all the things you would have learned as a docent 5 years ago, many of them are now wrong because we've actually now found out. Some of the older docents are not happy with me because they had to change their scripts, and as a docent, you never want to change your script once you have memorized it. So I am the destroyer of memorized scripts. I am sorry. But it's cool that it's a vibrant history, and we've also started every fall having events here to sort of bring together some of the work that we're doing, the scholarship. So this is my last slide. This is my favorite Fred Harvey picture. This is Albert Einstein at the Grand Canyon in 1930. So Albert Einstein came to America in 1930 when Nazism was first rising, gave a very famous series lecture all over the country, ended up at Caltech, and at Caltech he gave a lecture in which he admitted that he grew up playing cowboys and Indians just like every little German kid did, just like every kid did. So somebody had the idea that they should bring him to the Grand Canyon, which was a big thing to do. So when a celebrity came to the Grand Canyon, they were named an honorary chief. Albert Einstein didn't understand any of this. He barely spoke English at this point. Herman Schweitzer was there. Herman Schweitzer was German, so he could speak German to him. So Albert Einstein got off the train with his wife, and there were all these Native Americans there, and he thought they just lived there. I mean, he didn't know they worked for Fred Harvey, and their job was to be the Indians to be there when you got off the train. So they met for their photo op, which he thought was all very natural. And the Native Americans asked Herman Schweitzer, said, well, who is this guy? And they said, well, he invented the theory of relativity. And they said, okay, we will name him the Great Relative. And so this picture of Albert Einstein being named the Great Relative was on the front page of every newspaper in the country. That's what a big deal the Fred Harvey Company and the Grand Canyon and the places like Fonda were during that time. And I'm going to stop here and take questions, but I would say if you need to find me, this is where you find me on the internet. We have a Facebook page my author page, and we also have a Harvey Girls Cookbook page where we collect Fred Harvey recipes, of which there are many. But some of you may have other ones in your houses from relatives and stuff, because a lot of people in Santa Fe had recipes and we haven't found them yet. So find all your Fred stuff. Tell your friends we still want to find all the pictures and all the recipes. And thank you for your attention, and what questions can I answer for you? Yes. Are we miking? I'm sorry. I'm supposed to pause until we have a picture available so that when you ask a question, you will be photographed. So as you sign a release to be, no, go ahead.
I was just wondering about how often this was all when the steam locomotives were going. And
Steam through diesel through electric.
didn't they have to stop very often to refuel this?
Well, the original reason that there were Fred Harvey locations every 100 miles, because that's how far the original steam engines could go before they needed coal and water. But what happened, of course, this is true of America. Whenever the main technology of America speeds up slightly, things change. Mm-hmm. So when you follow the railroads, which is actually the first technology that really controlled the country, every time the railroads could go faster, things changed. And time was a big aspect of the railroads. I don't know if people know this. I was stunned to find this out, that before the railroads standardized time in America, there was no standard time in America. Okay, every city had its own time. And when you go into a train station, it was the time in that city. And it was not until the 1880s that, not the federal government wouldn't have been strong enough to do this. The railroad companies all came together in Chicago and had a meeting and decided how they would figure out what time it was. And they would all agree on the same time, and that the next day afterwards, they reset the clock so that everybody was on the same time. So time was a big aspect of their business. But every time the railroad speeded up, it was a big deal, and there were classic stories of the fastest, whenever you took the fastest run between Los Angeles and Chicago, you got on the front page of the paper. But it was, each of these things represented their own thing. But however, a lot of these cities had by this time fallen in love with their Fred Harvey restaurants. So even though maybe there was no reason to really still have a restaurant there from the railroad's point of view, it didn't cost them anything, and it was the best local restaurant. So sometimes people didn't get off because, of course, after the turn of the century, there were still dining cars, and they were in a way competing against themselves. But most of those places stayed open until the 1930s, and by that time, it really was mostly a dining car business and a big Union Station business. But yeah, it continued up through Amtrak.
Thank you.
Yes?
When we took a tour of Castaneda, they said that different Harvey houses had different food production duties, and they explained that was the bakery for this part of the rail line. Is that true of all of them, and did La Fonda have a specialty?
Well, keep in mind that La Fonda was not on the main line. La Fonda was on a branch line. It opened later. So we're actually finding out more and more about what these places did, but keep in mind that there were committed dairies located in Texas, in Arizona, in different places. And yes, different places did that. I don't know that the Castaneda did that. That's an interesting story.
They have a huge bakery.
Right, but all the big Harvey hotels had huge bakeries too. The Alvarado's knocked down there, so you can't see their bakery. They have a very cool bakery there, and they were the first of the big hotels in the Southwest. So it would not surprise me in the late 1880s, in the late 1890s, into the turn of the century when more were being built, that might have been originally the big bakery. And they have a very cool oven there, which they schlepped there from Leavenworth. I remember when we first discovered it, when they bought the place, and I was thinking, God, will they restore this? And it sounds like they're going to restore it. But basically, keep in mind that you had to deal with the people being served in the restaurants, you had to deal with the people eating on the dining cars, and you had to deal with the people who were buying prepared food on the dining cars, and the people who were buying prepared food through the windows of the dining cars when they stopped in the train station. So there was both cooking in restaurants and commissarying all through the system. And things changed based on staffing and based on how the company was going to be run. It was a very nimble company because most of the places could produce more than what they needed. And it was very well run. So it wouldn't surprise me at the very beginning that was true, but the Castaneda was also one of the first hotels to really stop being important because Las Vegas stopped being important as Albuquerque took over New Mexico. So when they built the Castaneda, Las Vegas was still a really big city that mattered in New Mexico. And sadly, we're hoping it's going to start mattering more again, but it changed a lot, and it was mostly towards the end there because it was the end of the Indian detours. So that may be true through a period of time. One of the things that we have the hardest time with in Fred Harvey history is that a lot of things that people are told are true for certain periods of time, but the Fred Harvey Company existed for almost 100 years. And you can't assume that a story that somebody told you about something that happened in the 40s that they saw, that it necessarily was happening in the 1880s or in the 1960s, but like any other thing, you interview a person, All they ever knew was that. And so that's what somebody writes down. And I had the hardest time writing the book, always saying, like, well, of course, the 1910s are not the same as the 1920s, and the 1940s aren't the same either, and you have to ask yourself what was happening at that time. So what's interesting is how these things changed as the company grew, as the country grew, as the railroad business changed, because originally the railroad business was a huge game of chess in the West, and people wanted to build their own individual tracks to everywhere to beat out their competitors. That got less and less, and then when the railroads were brought together by the federal government during the First World War, it was a foregone conclusion that that wasn't going to happen anymore. So that business of the railroads changed almost overnight. So part of the reason we love the Fred Harvey Company is because it existed long enough that we can learn about the 1870s and the 1880s and the 1910s and the 1940s and what's different about them culturally as businesses, and what's a consistent is the Harvey Company. What's a consistent is the Harvey girls. The consistent is, what do you do to have this incredible ability to have all this great service through each of these generations? So that's I think what's cool about the story. People in Las Vegas are just starting to figure this stuff out because they have been closed for business the longest. They were one of the earliest cities that mattered and one of the first cities that stopped mattering. But their history is incredibly rich, and we're trying to help them recapture it, and it's been really fun. Yes?
Harvey Company had their own refrigerated cars to move these places.
Yes.
Was that refrigerated by ice? Did they make their own ice? Or how did they keep it?
They were originally refrigerated by ice. There were rudimentary industrial refrigerants that big companies had before you had them in your house. So I forget the exact year that refrigerator cars started being powered by actual electrical refrigerants. But ice was like a huge thing. Ice was what it was all about. Ice and coal are what it was all about for the first 30 years of Fred Harvey. So it was a lot of ice, and part of the reason that Las Vegas was interesting to the company, even after it stopped being a tourist place, is because it was a huge ice-producing place. Right? In the winter, they would go and cut up all the ponds and send that ice up and down the system. So it was a huge part of it. But I don't know the exact year, but what you should always assume is that the railroads always got the technology first.
They would be the first to convert.
Right. So I don't know the exact year. It'd be a good thing to find out. But the Harvey, those trains, the refrigerator cars were actually very cool. And sometimes, there was a strike. George Pullman started a strike in the late 1800s that closed down the entire country. So Las Vegas was locked. There were protesters all around it, and the people couldn't get food, and they wouldn't let people leave the Harvey house. So they eventually they let the chef break into the Harvey car and start just cooking anything he could find in the refrigerator car because they were stuck there for 12 days, and the protesters wouldn't let them leave. So, yes.
You mentioned the Fred Harvey Company dealing with discrimination and the fact that the Harvey girls.
Do we want a microphone for her? Come on, Ed. I mean, really.
You mentioned that the Fred Harvey Company had to deal with discrimination in their business, and the fact that all of the Harvey girls were white and single. Could you speak a little bit more about what they did and how they did it?
Well, they weren't all white and single forever, but certainly for the first 30 years they were. And after the 1930s, there were more Native American and Hispanic Harvey girls in the Southwest, and there were more African American Harvey girls in the Midwest into the 50s and 60s. The Harvey Company is a great way of looking at attitudes towards race and diversity in this country. And what's interesting, at every turn, there's somebody who was criticizing the Fred Harvey Company for exploiting Native Americans, for only having white waitresses, for whatever. And there were other people pointing out that the Fred Harvey Company was one of the few companies that had women in some high positions, that had African American employees, that had basically created the Native American art market after the federal government had destroyed the original economy of Navajo and Hopi. So these are very controversial things, and I don't want to pretend that they did everything perfect. What's interesting was their endless desire to do whatever was the right thing as the right thing was emerging in each of these time periods. And what's interesting is how race is different during different times. We had Daggett Harvey here last night, and Daggett worked for the company during the 60s. The truth is they dealt with a lot more racial tension in the 60s because it was a more racially tense time than they did in the 40s and 50s. Because in the 40s and 50s, I've seen stories in African-American newspapers about how Fred Harvey was the most diverse and enlightened company in the world that allowed their dining cars to be run by African-American managers, not just waiters, but managers. So what I would say is they were way ahead of their time in all these areas, and they are a good way of studying what ahead of their time is. But look, when you look at the materials from the 1915 World's Fair, and you look at Native Americans who were moved to San Diego to be Indians for a year in a made-up pueblo, there are some issues that come to mind that are debated. But I think what's interesting, and I would love in one of these Harvey weekends in the future to bring the descendants of some of the Native Americans craftsmen who work with the Harvey Company, many of whom still live around here, because I think it's fine for all us white people to talk about whether they did the right thing, but I think it would be actually interesting to have that conversation. It wasn't about African Americans in the Southwest. There were very few African Americans in the Southwest. The racial issues in the Southwest were about Hispanics and Native Americans. In the Midwest, it was more about white people and African Americans. But what's interesting to talk to the living people in the Harvey Company about how hard they worked to do the right thing. The truth is, when somebody was called the N-word at a Harvey restaurant or seated in a bad seat because they were African American, people were surprised. It would be covered in the African American press because that was an unusual thing. Because the Fred Harvey Company was known as the most enlightened company in this area. But did it do things that later you wonder about? Yes. And what's interesting, Santa Fe was one of the cornerstones of this because, the first non-white Harvey girls were at La Fonda and at Gallup. And what's interesting is if you talked to the generation of white Harvey girls before them, they thought that that was the end of the Harvey girls. Because the original Harvey girls were all white, they were all from somewhere else, and the system had changed. But when you talk to the Native American and Hispanic Harvey girls, to them that was the civil rights movement, that they could be the first Native American. I remember meeting the first Native American Harvey girl at a bookstore in Albuquerque. She was the most interesting person. I mean, she'd had several great lives after being a Harvey girl. And if you know Harvey girls, they were unbelievably, spunky is too stupid a word because it makes it sound, I think spunky is like a sexist word. These were the first working women. They were the first women who would travel by themselves. Imagine going, being a single woman and getting on the train and going thousands of miles to a job in a place no one ever heard of. It's a real feminist story, in a lot of ways. But I think it's easier to study the attitudes in each generation than to just make a blanket statement. But I have to say that everything I found showed a company that was doing everything they can to do the right thing. And their idea to bring Caucasian women to the Southwest instead of African American men was based on what they thought would keep peace in these towns and keep their employees from being killed, which is something you have to consider too. Yes?
Follow-up. How are these Midwestern girls greeted in these small southwestern towns? Newcomers had money.
Well, did you ever see the beginning of the Harvey Girls movie? Yeah. So it takes about 10 hours for the girls to actually get to the town at the beginning of Harvey Girls movie. It's a huge production number, terrible. The cowboys are dancing for joy. New single women coming to town. How in any society do people treat the new single women? In any company, in any school, in anything, they're very excited. So the Harvey Company was like a matrimonial agency. I think that some of the women were scared once they got to these places and realized how remote they were and how rough it was. But interestingly, in the early days, what they would do is they would have tea dances in the Harvey restaurants on Friday nights to have nice, entertainment so men and women could meet each other in a proper kind of way. So they took seriously the idea if they were going to come to these towns, they were going to try to civilize them. And that's what they were going to do. But I think that some of the tensions you see in that movie, which, by the way, is an awful movie, really so long, and oh my God. But it does, I think, accurately show, the tensions of these towns. And but I think every woman's experience is different. We have started cataloging a lot of them, but there's still a lot of them missing. We have more people come up to us and say, my grandmother said she was a Harvey girl. That's probably a lie, right? And we're like, no. Then they tell the story and they could have been. So I think there's some people don't believe their grandparents and great-grandparents were Harvey girls. Some people were embarrassed to have been a waitress after they got married and settled down. So I think people are reclaiming their Harvey girlishness over many generations now, and we're hearing more and more stories. But I will tell you that we've had some diaries from Harvey girls. It was not a glamorous life. These girls worked like unbelievably hard. And keep in mind that the trains were always late. I mean, if you take the Super Chief's still always late. But there were many other trains that were always late. And if you were a Harvey girl, whenever the train came in, you woke up, put on the whole thing, went down and served. Didn't matter what time, day or night. So it was a 24/7 job, and it was really hard. So the diaries, expect them to be, I met Rock Hudson today. It was more like, I served 8,000 people today, and they're not like great reading necessarily. So we romanticize them. Being a waitress is really hard work, but they got really good pay. And if they stayed single, they had signed a contract, they would stay single for 6 months, which some of them did. And that they would stay in the employ for 6 months, and then they got a free ticket anywhere they wanted on the Santa Fe Railroad. And if they had been good employees, they were renewed. Some women did it one time. Other people made it their whole careers. 100,000 women. Every kind of story you could possibly want to hear about a Harvey girl, there's at least 10. Good, bad, and different. Yes, ma'am.
Does all this new information mean you're going to have another book soon?
I have another book. It's not about the Harvey girls. But no, I mean, honestly, I write books about different topics every time. But I think that no one can say that I haven't stuck with the Harvey stories in the 5 years after my book came out. I mean, the truth is, I took my shot at what I thought was a really good retelling of the Harvey story. And part of the reason I come back to the Southwest, one, because it's fun and because I fish, but two, because I want other people to write books that I can read. I mean, I want them to be interested in the areas that I was not as familiar with and tell those stories. And we're trying to encourage that both in people of all ages, of students, of older people who are coming to the subject. So the fact that there's like 4 Fred Harvey-related books due to come out next year. And besides the show here, there's a museum show at the NAU Klein Library Special Collections that opened last week. There's one opening at the Herd in April. The Grand Canyon will celebrate the 100th anniversary of the National Park Service this next year. And we will all meet here again next year for Fred Head Weekend number 6. That's my next book. And what we try to do is encourage people to do the work, because you know what's funny about the Fred Harvey story? Every city has its own Fred Harvey story. And so part of the difficulty of writing this book was to tell all the stories without veering too far into any one story, because each of them is a real great story over a long period of time. But so and the other thing that I think we've very, very aggressively tried to do was make New Mexico the center of this. Because even though the Fred Harvey Company was in lots of different states, I think New Mexico is uniquely suited to carry on the history. And I think it's also the state that most impacted Fred Harvey when he was alive. Most of the innovations of the Fred Harvey Company happened, I would say, because of New Mexico. Because New Mexico was a really hard place to work, much harder than Kansas. And a lot of the systems they put into place to solve New Mexico. So I think it's really interesting that even though Arizona was ahead of New Mexico, had Grand Canyon, and the Herd had the initial Fred Harvey business collection, the truth is, since I've been involved with this, it has been the investment of Santa Fe, it has been invested of Las Vegas, to really capture this Fred Harvey history and make it part of the storytelling of this state. So that's why I do that. But I think you're going to see many publications from different people. You're seeing, I don't know if you've seen the books that Rosa Latimer has been doing. She's going state by state and replicating stories of the Harvey houses. But that's great. That's the way it should be. I mean, when I was working on my book, we were working from books that were written in the 60s and master's theses that were written in the 40s. I mean, the amount of writing that had been done about this was so minimal. So, yes, sir.
As a reader, first I wanted to say thanks for the recipes.
Thank you. Which ones have you made?
Pardon me?
Which ones have you made?
I haven't had a chance to make any of them yet.
Come
but,
on.
I'm planning on opening a division of the Fred Harvey Company in Seattle to all my friends when I get back home. So,
Okay, good.
but
Let us know when you're open. We'll all come.
Okay.
And you'll have really good wine, too, up there, so that's good.
Okay. Secondly, I wanted to tell you as a reader, I really love the way that you intertwine the history of Fred Harvey and the Fred Harvey Company with the history of the American West. I thought you did a brilliant job of that, and
Thank
I
you.
really enjoyed reading that.
Thank you. Well, that was the goal. And you know, it wasn't just my goal. I mean, the truth is, the Fred Harvey Company was telling the story of the American West as it was unfolding. So it seemed like the right thing to do to write the book that way, because besides their own business, part of their business was explaining not only the history of the West, but how it was changing And they did a really good job of that, so it seemed like the right thing to do. It was also just a good excuse for me to learn about what I think is the most underappreciated period in American history, which is the post-Civil War era up through the Depression, which I think hardly anybody really understands, and it was really great to learn about it. Any other questions? I've worn you out. Well, listen, good luck with your docenting. Those of you who have not gotten the book, please get it. If you want signed copies, we will be at the New Mexico History Museum on Sunday showing the new documentary about the Harvey girls and some new interviews that were done with Harvey girls. And Alan Affelt from La Posada and from Castaneda will come and talk a little bit about the work they're doing there. And we'll give you a report on the state of the Union of the Fredhead Nation. Jenny. Oh, I'm sorry. I have a new book that just came out. Some of you may have seen Patrick Kennedy on 60 Minutes last week. So that book about mental illness and Patrick Kennedy, I wrote that book with Patrick Kennedy. So I will be at Collected Works on November 2nd. I believe all the Collected Works events start at 6 o'clock, discussing the book, discussing the work that I do in mental illness, and signing copies of the book, and also signing copies of Appetite for America. So thank you, Jenny, for reminding me. You'd think that over all these years, my hopeless self-promotion would be much stronger than that, but thank you for reminding me. Thank you very much for your attention. It's great to meet you.
Thank you, Stephen, so much.